He stacked river slate against his cabin walls. Then the deadliest winter hit. Brenner Vale did not notice the cold first. He noticed the silence. The river that usually whispered beyond the cottonwoods had gone still beneath a skin of ice. Even the magpies had disappeared. The valley looked as if it were holding its breath. Inside his small cabin in Red Elk Draw, Brenner lifted another flat slab of river slate and pressed it carefully against the north wall. Each stone stole a little more space from the room. Each stone made his neighbors shake their heads. A shadow filled the doorway. Gideon Rusk stood there with snow clinging to his boots. He had survived more winters than most men cared to remember. He looked at the growing wall of slate, then at 10-year-old Jonah feeding tiny sticks into the stove. 6-year-old Elsie sat wrapped in a blanket that looked much too thin for the weather already creeping across Montana. Gideon finally spoke. "When that fire dies, those rocks won't save those children." Brenner did not answer. He pressed clay between two stones with his thumb until no crack remained. Sometimes a man stayed quiet because he had no answer. Sometimes he stayed quiet because he had already made his choice. If stories of frontier survival and forgotten American wisdom mean something to you, stay with this one. What happened inside this little cabin before winter ended left an entire valley questioning everything it thought it knew about staying alive. Only 6 weeks later, the Black Ridge blizzard would bury every road leading out of Red Elk Draw. Most families believed they needed bigger fires. Brenner believed he needed walls that could remember warmth. Months earlier, life had looked different. He and his wife Clara had arrived with 2 children, 1 wagon, and enough hope to overlook the cabin waiting for them. It leaned slightly to one side. The roof sagged. Cold wind slipped through the walls even during summer evenings. Still, it was theirs. For a little while, that felt like enough. Then everything changed. Clara became sick after giving birth too early. The baby never opened its eyes. 3 days later, the cabin became painfully quiet. Brenner folded Clara's shawl and placed it inside a wooden chest. He chopped wood before sunrise. Cooked meals for Jonah and Elsie. Fixed broken tools. Fetched water. Worked until darkness covered the valley. His hands never stopped moving. Only after the children were asleep did he sit beside the empty bed and stare into the stove without adding another log. Work became the only thing keeping him upright. When Clara's older sister Ruth arrived, Brenner accepted the help without asking many questions. She cleaned the cabin, cooked simple meals, read stories to Elsie while Jonah followed his father outside. For several weeks, the little family almost looked whole again. Then one morning, Brenner returned from the creek carrying 2 buckets of water. The hitching post stood empty. His strongest mule was gone. So was Ruth. Inside the cabin, the small cash box sat open. Not empty, just lighter. A folded note rested beside it. "I chose a life that still has a future." Nothing else. No apology. No goodbye. Elsie kept asking when her aunt would come home. Jonah stopped asking after he saw his father's face. Without the mule, hauling firewood became nearly impossible. Every trip now depended on Brenner's shoulders alone. News traveled fast across the frontier. Before long, Gideon Rusk stopped by to see the damage for himself. He examined the roof, pressed loose chinking with one finger, walked around the woodpile. Then he split a fresh log. Water shined inside the green cottonwood. Poor fuel. He asked only one question. How much wood? Less than 2 cords. Gideon looked toward the hills where dark clouds already gathered. "You'll need at least 5. The words settled heavily inside the cabin. Jonah quietly stared at the floor. Elsie hugged her blanket tighter. Gideon rested one rough hand against the wall. "This cabin eats firewood." He turned toward Brenner. "Sell the place while you still can. Take the children to town." Brenner looked around the room. Thin walls, small stove, too little wood. He knew every word Gideon spoke was true, but truth did not change what he owned. Selling meant giving up the only home his children had left. That night, after Jonah and Elsie had fallen asleep, Brenner sat beside the stove with a kettle warming over the last steady coals. The iron slowly cooled. The room changed with it. Warm air faded almost as quickly as it had come. He reached for the kettle and noticed the flat piece of river slate resting beneath its loose handle. Without thinking, he touched it. The stone still held warmth. Not much, but enough to surprise him. He waited another several minutes. The stove kept cooling. The room grew sharper against his skin. The slate stayed warm. He picked it up with both hands. His mind drifted years backward to an old wheelwright shop where thick stone floors stayed warm long after the forge had quieted. The memory refused to leave. He looked toward the empty cabin wall, then back at the stone. A question formed quietly inside his mind. What if the fire wasn't supposed to heat the air? What if it could heat the house itself? Before daylight reached the valley, Brenner tied a rope around an old wooden sled. He carried only a pry bar and determination. By sunset, he returned from North Fork Creek dragging 4 heavy slabs of river slate. Jonah hurried outside to help. Neither of them spoke. They simply leaned together against the rope until the sled reached the cabin door. Brenner stacked the stones beside the stove. He watched. He waited. For the first time since Clara's passing, he felt something stronger than exhaustion begin to take shape. Outside, the wind pushed through the pine trees with a deeper voice than before. Winter was no longer coming. It had started. The next morning began long before sunrise. Frost covered the cabin window from corner to corner. Brenner stepped outside, tied the rope around his sled, and headed toward North Fork Creek. The trip was slow. Each slab of river slate weighed almost as much as a sack of grain. By the time he returned, his gloves were stiff with frozen sweat, and his shoulders burned with every step. Day after day, the pile beside the cabin grew. The stack of firewood barely changed. People noticed. One evening, Mara Kent crossed the yard carrying a small jar of saved bacon drippings. She stopped when she saw Brenner fitting another slab against the wall. "You've been hauling rock instead of wood?" Brenner nodded. "I don't have enough wood either way." Mara studied the unfinished wall. "Stone feels cold." "It does. So why fill your cabin with it?" Brenner rested another slab in place before answering. "Because I don't need it to stay cold." She looked at him for a long moment, but said nothing. Before leaving, she placed the jar on the table. "If that wall falls," she said quietly, "I'll come for the children." Brenner simply nodded. The next week became harder. His hands split open despite the gloves. The sled rope cut deep into his palms. Some afternoons he had to stop halfway home just to catch his breath. Still, every trip ended with another row of slate rising beside the stove. Jonah watched everything. Without asking permission, he began slipping smaller stones onto the sled before the walk home. The first time, Brenner removed them. The second time, he left them there. Neither spoke about it. Father and son simply pulled together. One cold evening, Brenner warmed several flat stones beside the stove before sliding them beneath the children's bed. He waited until both had fallen asleep. Near midnight, he knelt beside the bed and reached underneath. The slate still carried warmth. Not enough to heat the room, enough to warm his hand. He checked again before dawn. The stones had cooled, but they had not turned bitter cold like the wooden floor. He looked toward Jonah. The boy had stayed asleep all night. Elsie had not coughed once. Brenner quietly smiled to himself. The idea was working, only not in the way anyone outside would understand. A few days later, an older widow named Sarah Thorne stopped beside North Fork Creek. She watched Brenner loading another sled. "You keep choosing the pretty stones," she said. Brenner looked up. Sarah picked up one slab and struck it lightly with her hammer. It answered with a dull sound. She tossed it aside. Then she struck another. A clear ring floated across the frozen creek. "Take this one." She handed it to him. "The heavier stones hold warmth longer." Brenner listened carefully. Sarah walked back with him to the cabin. She studied every wall, ran her fingers across the clay joints, pressed against the growing stone bench beside the stove. Finally, she looked at him. The idea is sound. Then she shook her head. The work isn't finished. Over the next several days, she returned again and again. She showed Brenner how to pack clay deep behind every slab, how to stagger each joint so the wall became one solid body, how to build more stone around the stove where the heat stayed strongest. She also changed the way he used his fire. Big flames waste wood, she told him. Steady coals feed the stone. That single lesson changed everything. Instead of burning large fires that faded quickly, Brenner kept a slow bed of glowing coals alive from morning until night. The walls warmed little by little. The bench beside the stove stayed comfortable long after supper. Even the north corner no longer felt like ice. One morning, Sarah rested her hand against the stone. She nodded once. It remembers. Those 2 words stayed with Brenner. By early December, nearly half the cabin had been lined with river slate. The room felt smaller, but it also felt different. Heat no longer rushed away the moment the flames settled. It lingered. Word spread across Red Elk Draw. Some laughed. Others simply watched. Then Silas Vane arrived. His polished wagon looked strangely clean beside Brenner's weathered cabin. Silas smiled as he stepped down. "I've come to make your troubles easier." He offered $38 for the property, enough to pay Brenner's debt, enough to leave before winter closed every road. His eyes wandered toward the stone walls. "You've worked hard." Then he gave a small laugh. "But rocks stay cold." Brenner looked past him toward the hills where dark clouds were beginning to gather again. He answered with one word. "No." Silas adjusted his gloves. "I'll return after the first blizzard." He climbed back into the wagon. As winter grows worse, that answer usually changes. The wagon disappeared down the trail. Brenner watched until it vanished. Then he picked up his sled once more. He still needed more stone, because somewhere beyond those mountains, the storm everyone feared had already begun moving toward Red Elk Draw. Before we continue, think about this for a moment. On the frontier, surviving winter was often decided weeks before the first great storm ever arrived. The first hard wind reached Red Elk Draw before sunrise. Snow swept across the open ground in long white ribbons. By noon, the trail beyond Brenner's cabin had disappeared. He stepped outside only long enough to bring in the last armload of wood. Every movement now had to matter. Inside, the stove burned with steady coals instead of tall flames. Sarah's words stayed fresh in his mind. The stone would only give back what it received. Jonah helped stack the remaining wood beside the stove. "There isn't much left," he said quietly. Brenner looked at the pile. "I know." Neither of them spoke again. There was nothing useful left to say. By evening, the wind found every weakness in the valley. Cabin doors rattled. Loose shutters slammed. Snow packed itself against walls until the windows showed nothing but white. The storm had arrived. Brenner fed the stove one small split log at a time. Not too much, not too little. The slate around the stove slowly became warm beneath his hand. The north wall followed. The stone bench where Jonah and Elsie slept stayed warm enough that neither child moved closer to the fire. Outside, the storm only grew louder. Near midnight, a deep thud rolled across the roof. Then another. Heavy snow was piling faster than either Brenner or the cabin had ever faced. He pushed open the front door only a few inches. The wind slammed it shut again. Snow already stood halfway up the entrance. He grabbed the shovel. Jonah reached for his coat. "No, I can help. You help by staying warm." Brenner forced the door open with his shoulder. The wind hit him so hard he nearly lost his footing. He shoveled only enough to keep the entrance from sealing shut. Within minutes, the path disappeared again beneath fresh snow. The storm erased his work as fast as he finished it. He hurried back inside with ice covering his beard. Elsie handed him Clara's old towel without saying a word. He dried his face. Then he checked the walls. The slate still carried warmth. Hours passed. The woodpile kept shrinking. The storm never slowed. Just after midnight, another problem appeared. A sharp smell drifted through the cabin. Smoke. Not much. Enough. Brenner looked toward the stove. Gray smoke slipped from the edge of the iron door instead of rising through the chimney. The wind had forced the draft backward. He wrapped a damp cloth over Jonah's and Elsie's mouths. Stay low. Then he stepped into the storm again. The cold struck like a hammer. He kept one hand against the cabin wall so he would not lose his way. The chimney stood somewhere above him, hidden by blowing snow. He climbed carefully onto the roof. The wind tried to pull him backward with every step. At last his hands found the loose chimney cap. He forced it back into place. It fought him. Then suddenly it settled. A moment later, smoke began rising into the storm instead of pouring back inside. When Brenner climbed down, his fingers had almost lost feeling. He shut the door behind him. The children were waiting exactly where he had left them. The cabin slowly cleared. Morning was still many hours away. By 3 o'clock, only a few pieces of firewood remained. Jonah looked at the nearly empty pile. What happens when it's gone? Brenner placed another small log onto the coals. We use everything we've already stored. The last pieces burned before dawn. The flames disappeared. Only glowing coals remained. Then even they faded. The room slowly cooled. But something surprising happened. The walls did not. Brenner pressed his hand against the thick slate beside the stove. It still carried warmth. The bench remained warmer than the air. He moved both children closer against the stone, wrapped every blanket around them. Then he sat beside them with one hand resting against the wall. The cabin had become its own source of comfort. Not because the fire still burned. Because the stone remembered. Outside, the Black Ridge blizzard screamed across the valley. Inside, the warmth faded slowly instead of disappearing all at once. Those extra hours changed everything. As gray daylight finally reached the frozen window, Brenner heard something beyond the wind. A knock. 3 slow knocks against the cabin door. No one should have been outside. Not after a night like that. Brenner picked up his lantern and walked toward the entrance. Whoever stood on the other side had somehow survived the deadliest night of the winter. He lifted the wooden bar from the door. Brenner pulled the door open only a few inches. Snow rushed inside. Standing against the wind was Gideon Rusk. His coat was white with ice. His beard carried frozen snow from chin to collar. He stepped inside without wasting a word. The door slammed shut behind him. For a long moment he simply looked around the cabin. The stove held only a bed of fading coals. The woodpile was empty. Yet Jonah and Elsie sat awake on the stone bench, wrapped in blankets instead of shaking on the floor. Gideon walked slowly toward the wall. He rested his rough hand against the slate, then against the wooden boards farther away. The difference surprised him. He checked again. The stone still held a little warmth. The wood felt like ice. He looked back at Brenner. You were right. It was the first time those words had ever left Gideon's mouth. Outside, daylight revealed what the storm had done. Roofs had collapsed beneath heavy snow. Broken fences disappeared under deep drifts. The road into town no longer existed. Later that afternoon, Sarah Thorne arrived. She brushed snow from her shoulders before stepping inside. Without speaking, she examined the walls, the stove, and the stone bench. Finally, she smiled to herself. It answered. That was all she said. By the following morning, more neighbors slowly reached Brenner's cabin. Some had walked for hours through waist-deep snow. Others came searching for missing friends. The news they carried grew heavier with every visitor. One family had burned every stick of wood before midnight. Their cabin turned bitterly cold before sunrise. Another house had stayed warm while the fire lasted, but lost nearly all its heat before dawn. Several families survived only because neighbors dug them out in time. Every story sounded different. Each ended the same way. The fire had gone out too soon. Gideon stood beside Brenner's wall once more. This cabin kept giving after the stove stopped. Brenner nodded. It had to. It had to. A few days later, the road slowly opened again. Silas Vane returned exactly as he had promised. His wagon rolled into the yard. His confident smile faded the moment he saw smoke rising from Brenner's chimney. He climbed down and looked around the cabin. "You stayed." "We did." Silas glanced toward the stone walls inside the open doorway. For the first time, he had no clever answer. Before he could speak again, Gideon stepped forward. "I've seen houses with twice the wood." Sarah joined him. "I've seen better stoves." Mara Kent folded her arms beside the porch. "I've seen stronger cabins." Gideon looked directly at Silas. They all lost heat too fast. Silas understood. No bargain waited for him anymore. Without another word, he climbed back onto his wagon and drove away. He never returned. As winter slowly loosened its grip, people from across the valley began visiting Brenner's cabin. Not to laugh, to learn. He showed them how to choose dense river slate, how to stagger each layer, how to seal every gap with clay, how to build thick walls near the stove instead of around the whole cabin. Most important of all, he showed them patience. A slow fire, steady coals, hours instead of flames. Jonah carried smaller stones beside his father. Elsie proudly called the heated bench the warm wall. Soon other cabins began changing. Stone benches appeared beside stoves. North walls grew thicker. Families burned less wood but stayed warmer through the night. No one claimed stone could replace fire. It simply made every piece of firewood last longer. Years later, newcomers often asked why so many cabins in Red Elk Draw had walls lined with river slate. The older settlers usually smiled before pointing toward Brenner Vale's place near North Fork Creek. They remembered the winter that buried the valley. They remembered the families who nearly lost everything. And they remembered one quiet widower who answered winter with work instead of surrender. As evening settled over the valley once more, Brenner placed another split log onto the stove. The flames slowly filled the firebox. Beside him, the stone wall waited patiently to gather every bit of warmth it could hold for the long night ahead. If you enjoyed this frontier survival story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves true American frontier wisdom and unforgettable survival stories.